So clearly at this point in time, there is a ton of hype and anticipation around Zelda Breath of the Wild 2's ultimate release on the Nintendo Switch in spring of 2023, and there's been an interesting story floating around online as of late discussing and pointing out the fact that this will actually be the longest gap in a mainline Zelda entry in the series that we have seen so far, period. And in today's video, I want to take a look at the article that actually spawned this discussion, have a closer look at the history of the Zelda series and its development time cycles as a whole, and have that final conversation on where we should be setting our expectations now that Zelda is an open world game with development time cycles going forward. What's up, Nation? If it's your first time on the channel, make sure you join Sunbro Nation by subscribing below, hit the like button on this video if you enjoy it today, and make sure you turn on your bell notification icon so you're kept up to date with all the newest gaming news. As I mentioned, guys, today we are talking about Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 and the anticipation around this game's release, as clearly it is set to be a blockbuster title that will probably propel the series to new heights, which is already saying something because the original Breath of the Wild definitely did that, coming in well over 20+ million copies sold at this point, and it's not slowing down as the Switch continues to sell. People go pick up Breath of the Wild because it is, quite frankly, a masterpiece of a game. Now, one interesting topic that has appeared online that people have been talking about as of late does come from Nintendo Life. Last Saturday, they put this out, and it really is an interesting point because it says, random, we've been waiting over half a decade for a new mainline Zelda game. It's the longest gap between new entries. And that's the truth, because if you do look at history, there's some interesting, and they cite a tweet that kind of pointed this out, but there's some interesting takeaways. As you can see, today marks the longest ever gap in a brand new release for the Legend of Zelda series since the first game released in 1986. The previous record for the longest time between releases was Link's Awakening and Ocarina of Time, which took 5 years, 5 months, and 15 days. Now, of course, you have to take out kind of any type of remakes at that point, or in, ports essentially, but in terms of a new Zelda experience. And it's kind of interesting because we really are going to be in uncharted territories going forward, as Breath of the Wild was the very first open world Zelda game, and now is open world the new formula going forward, or do they ever go back to a somewhat more linear progression and linear level design style? Well, that'll be up for debate and speculation because we clearly don't know. Here we have, continuing on, interestingly, every console 3D Zelda game release has taken longer than the last. Time between Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, 523 days. Majora's Mask and Wind Waker was 960. Wind Waker and Twilight Princess was 1437. Twilight Princess Skyward Sword was 1825. Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild 1932 days. And where we are at now, Breath of the Wild and today is 1995 days at the time of this tweet. Now, what is interesting about that is clearly we know that Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be a very bold project, as when it was announced that it would officially be pushed to spring of 2023, Mr. Aonuma went out of his way to say, well, this isn't just the big open Hyrule that you already know and love, it's also taking place in the skies. We know based off the original trailer that we saw that there are going to be underground sections from the looks of things. So by all accounts, this is definitely going to be a very ambitious entry in the Zelda series. And do they just keep getting more ambitious than this? Because if you look at, to close out this tweet, if this trend continues, the next 3D Zelda game would release in 2029. And that's where I think you have to have the idea behind open world is like, yes, open world games do take longer to create, and there is a lot more to control in them in terms of minimizing bugs and glitches and ensuring that there's plenty of quests and things going on in the world, and you can actually go in any direction you want to go to knock out the game. It's a very unique design, and I thought it would be a fun idea to take a look together at the history of Zelda releases, period, and kind of try to gauge where we are maybe headed from here in terms of length between development cycles, because you have to go way back in time, all the way to February 21st, 1986 for the original Legend of Zelda game that was released. And of course, on the NES, we are not talking about massive technological feats. We are talking about 8-bit gaming, which you could pump out a game in 6 months to a year. You could get really aggressive and throw a lot of people on it and turn around and have a sequel to a game in no time at all. And so January 14th, the following year in 1987, we of course saw Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, arguably still probably one of the worst entries in the series. At least that's how I feel about it. It definitely is one that I don't go go back to for nostalgia reasons. Granted, I wasn't playing it when it was originally released, but also it's just the first time they ever did something very different with the side-scrolling attempt, and they never went back to that in a Zelda game. So I think it kind of tells you that that's not the formula that they wanted to go with long term. Then the game that arguably put the formula on the map is A Link to the Past, and it's one that today people will still argue online that this is the best Zelda release ever created, and it really did lay that template for the dungeons you would go traverse, find the items in them, find your dungeon map and compass. And granted, we had some of those stuff in the original Legend of Zelda as well. This is the one that put it all together. You had the light and dark world, very reminiscent of the time travel mechanic found in Ocarina of Time, and this was released on November 21st of 1991. So we did have quite a bit more development time from 1987 to 1991, and being the end of the year in 1991 at that. Now, the image here is from the remake of Link's Awakening, but of course they are talking about the actual original Link's Awakening that was released in 1993. So you have just a couple year turnaround in that development cycle. And this is also the era, you have to remember, where Nintendo was supporting handheld and console gaming at the same time. So you did have a lot of, you get a brand new handheld Zelda, and then you get a brand new console Zelda. That is a different era that we are in now with the Switch, and I think the ports, and hopefully they go back to that formula, because I want 2D Zelda games. I do think that Link's Awakening is actually a type of game that, yes, that's great. Remake it from the ground up, bring it over with modern visuals, and there's so many other Zelda games in the 2D catalog that they should be doing that with next, such as the Oracle games, as well as Minish Cap. I mean, the list goes on. If we could get remakes of even things like Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, I am all for that as well, in addition to just creating entirely new titles. And A Link Between Worlds arguably being close to a remake of A Link to the Past, but it's really not. It is its own game, but just kind of set and themed in that same world, and definitely is a love letter to that title. Bring all of those classic 2D Zelda games over to the Switch in its current life cycle. Hopefully we're talking about backwards compatibility for a long time to come, and then start also developing some brand new top-down or 2D style Zelda games with prettier visuals in addition to these main releases, or maybe as opposed to going all open world with Zelda Breath of the Wild style games, maybe we see them release those with far gaps in between, and then we get like a more traditional dungeon focused 3D linear style Zelda that gets developed alongside of it. I just hope we have multiple teams in the Zelda world working on different projects, because yes, once upon a time we were seeing much more frequent releases for this franchise. And then you have to go to, of course, the game that cemented the series as truly revolutionary, and I think you can argue that Zelda Ocarina of Time ushered in what 3D gaming was, because lock-on targeting, so many different mechanics that this thing put on the map were not a thing at that point in time, and it blew everyone's mind. And there is a reason rather that it's still the highest reviewed Metacritic scored game of all time period. And of course this was out in November 21st 1998. Now, an interesting correlation between Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask is the fact that on Breath of the Wild, we are using the same engine in Breath of the Wild 2. It is not a brand new graphical overhaul like we typically see with new Zelda releases, and this was actually one callback that you can make, is that Majora's Mask used the same assets and engine as Ocarina of Time, just with some touched up visuals. And of course you had to have that red expansion pack to actually run it in the Nintendo 64, because it essentially used more RAM than what the base model would allow for. And luckily those expansion packs came with the games that needed them, so sometimes you'd end up with multiple if you bought games like Donkey Kong 64 plus Majora's Mask. But regardless, that's a pretty quick turnaround of November 21st 1998 to April 27th 2000. So literally less than 2 years is what we're talking there with the same engine. However, this is where the open world conversation comes into play, because it is very different developing an open world game with, even if it is the same assets, than it is with something like Ocarina of Time to Majora's Mask. Also keeping in mind the fact that we went through the pandemic during the time that Breath of the Wild 2 is in development, so keep that in the back of your head as well. Now then, of course, the handheld side of things, just shortly after, we had two of arguably my favorite 2D style Zelda games, period. That's Oracle of Ages and Seasons. Both fantastic games. One has what the other doesn't. One's more focused on action, one's more focused on puzzles. I absolutely love these titles, and those were out on 2001. Then just a year later, 2002, we got the Four Swords adventure on, or no, this was not adventure. This was maybe the one that was released on the Game Boy Advance, which was a much shorter side project. I believe the only way this was released and how I played it was as part of that Link to the Past release on the Game Boy Advance that you saw a lot of SNES titles ultimately get, you know, ported over to handheld, because that was the first time you could take those games on the go. And we have Legend of Zelda Wind Waker out in 2002. Besides this kind of spin-off attempt, I guess you could call the Four Swords, it was like the first thing they were trying to do with co-op, and, you know, shortly right around each other, because of course these games use the same style link. So we did have this one technically out first, but we had the mainline release of Wind Waker in December 13th of 2002. And shortly thereafter, a couple more years, we have The Legend of Zelda Four Swords Adventure, which is a fantastic co-op game for GameCube. You can play it alone as well, but a really fun, cool, I think, forgotten about Zelda game. Then you have, you know, and that was on a console, even though it was more of a 2D style, so really unique timing there. Then you have Minish Cap out that same year on the handheld, of course, another fantastic 2D Zelda game, and kind of is your origin story behind Link's hat. Now, at this point, you have Twilight Princess. And so now keep in mind, as far as mainline releases, we are end of 2002 to 2006 as far as Wind Waker to Twilight Princess, which was the longest development time up to that point in terms of mainline 3D console Zeldas. And then we have some Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, 2007, 2009. You see the frequency of releases though with Zelda titles when they're getting love on both a handheld and a console, as opposed to what we see now with the Switch. And I think the answer to that is ports like Skyward Sword HD we got on the Switch, but Skyward Sword was released in 2011. That's quite a bit longer than the wait that Wind Waker and Twilight Princess had between each other. As we mentioned, A Link Between Worlds being the last brand new 2D style Zelda game that we've seen developed or released, period. That was out in 2013. Zelda Triforce Heroes in 2015. This was an interesting one, and one that really, I kind of just forced myself to play it because it was a Zelda game. Not saying it's bad, it doesn't have that classical Zelda feel. It didn't hook me the same way that Four Swords Adventure did. I will say that, even though it is very akin to that style game with 3 different links as opposed to 4. Then that brings us ultimately to Zelda Breath of the Wild, where we are at today, the last mainline entry in the franchise, and we're at March 3rd, 2017, aka the launch date of the Switch. And now we are currently waiting on Breath of the Wild 2 to ultimately come out. And while I am very ready to see this game released, and while I'm 1000% ready to pick this game up day one and fully immerse myself in the world and experience all the new things that Nintendo are creating with this entry, I do think that something like a delay is not necessarily a bad thing, because Nintendo has such a bold vision. You just have to ask that question: where do we go from here in terms of future Zelda releases? Are we going to be waiting until years like 2029 to get the next release after this drops in 2023? And that's where I am personally hopeful that we have teams like Grezzo and the other development teams that often do ports and remakes also work on brand new Zelda experiences that can be sold on the Switch from the ground up, new ones, and also port the old classic Zeldas and make them all playable on the Switch, because the Switch is such an incredible console and hardcore Zelda fans need to have easy access to play these timeless classics that should all be experienced. But I want to hear from you guys at this point in the video, all your personal thoughts and opinions around the development timeline of Zelda Breath of the Wild 1 to 2. Do you think Nintendo stays open world for the series from here and we can always expect long development gaps like this going forward? Or do you think that maybe we do start to see supplemental Zelda titles, not just remakes, remasters, and ports, but from the ground up, brand new 2D titles? And how would you personally prefer to see Nintendo handle the series going forward? So regardless of your thoughts and feelings on everything we talked about today, I do look forward to hearing from you all in the comments down below before you leave the video, as I do look forward to getting a back and forth conversation started with you all around these topics. Go watch yesterday's video next if you haven't already, where we boot up Sonic the Hedgehog 06 together and discuss what Sega needs to do this time around on the Nintendo Switch for Sonic Frontiers to avoid a similar catastrophe that game was. Also, make sure you like, subscribe, turn on your notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.